The precise, recycled air of the archival facility, nestled deep within the vast complex of the border checkpoint, always carried the faint scent of ozone and aged paper. For Blake, this was the smell of order, of controlled information, of a world meticulously catalogued and understood. They moved with an economy of motion honed over years, gloved hands extracting, scanning, and reshelving with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Each document, every confiscated item, held a specific place within a meticulously designed taxonomy, a system Blake had largely conceived and perfected. Their work was the bedrock of the checkpoint's intelligence, the quiet accumulation of data that informed every decision made at the gates above. Today, the task was to clear a backlog of unidentified origin, class Omega, containers. This category, rarely invoked, was reserved for items that defied immediate classification or source tracing. It represented the small, irritating imperfections in an otherwise flawless system, a challenge Blake met with professional resolve. The fluorescent panels hummed overhead, a monotonous yet comforting drone that filled the otherwise silent vault. Blake consulted the digital manifest, the glowing text a stark contrast to the dust motes dancing in the sterile light. Container 73 Delta 9, marked simply with a faded, hand-drawn symbol resembling a fractured circle, was next. They located the steel-reinforced crate on a lower shelf, its surface cool beneath their gloved fingertips. The latch mechanism, stiff with disuse, clicked open with a sharp report that echoed briefly in the cavernous space. Inside, nestled amongst packing foam and desiccated silica gel packets, lay several mundane items, a corroded brass compass, a bundle of brittle, untranslatable letters tied with hemp twine, and a small, lead-weighted fishing net. Blake processed each, assigning them their provisional codes for later, more thorough analysis. Then, their gaze settled on the final object. It was roughly spherical, no larger than a grapefruit, yet its presence seemed to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it. Its surface was a uniform, matte black, but not the black of obsidian or coal. This was a color that seemed to deny light, a void made solid. Blake's meticulous training asserted itself. They reached for it, their fingers anticipating the cold, hard feel of stone or metal. Instead, their gloves registered a texture like dry, compacted moss, yet unyielding. It possessed no discernible seams, no visible entry points, no marks of manufacture. It was simply there. Blake lifted the object. It felt lighter than its apparent density suggested, yet held a peculiar gravitational pull, a subtle resistance against their palm. This was the event. It was not a violent rupture, nor a dramatic revelation, but a quiet, insidious anomaly that challenged the very premise of their ordered world. Blake rotated it slowly, their brow furrowed beneath the brim of their visor. There were no symbols, no etchings, no indication of purpose or origin. It was a perfect, silent mystery. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated within the object, or perhaps within Blake's own skull. They pressed their gloved thumb against its surface. It felt wrong. The fluorescent light seemed to dim, ever so slightly, for a fleeting moment, then return to full intensity. Blake blinked, attributing it to fatigue. They had been working for 10 hours straight. Blake placed the object on the disinfected steel table. Their usual procedure for unclassifiable items involved cross-referencing against various historical archives, obscure ethnographic databases, and even theoretical physics journals. But this object offered no entry point for research. It existed outside context. It was an orphan of reality. Their gaze fell upon a small, yellowed slip of parchment, half hidden beneath the packing foam. It was not official documentation. The paper felt like vellum, thin and ancient. It wasn't a letter from any known alphabet, nor a pictograph Blake recognized. It was a jagged, twisting sigil, composed of impossible angles that seemed to shift and reform in the periphery of their vision. It was the reveal. This symbol, like the object itself, defied logic, yet it possessed a disturbing familiarity, as if it belonged to a language Blake had forgotten, or one that never existed. A prickling sensation began at the nape of Blake's neck, spreading down their spine. The air in the archive, once predictable, now felt thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. The hum of the fluorescent lights took on a dissonant quality, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate directly inside their skull. For a moment, the sterile lines of the shelving unit seemed to waver, their precise geometry blurring at the edges, only to snap back into perfect focus a moment later. Blake shook their head, a tremor running through their arm. They attributed it to eye strain, to the long hours spent staring at screens in microfiche. This was more than an unclassifiable object, it felt like a deliberate disruption. Blake felt a profound sense of isolation, the sheer weight of their solitary discovery. The very notion of classification, the ordered grid upon which their entire world was built, suddenly felt fragile, ephemeral. The symbol on the parchment seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light that only Blake could perceive, pulling them deeper into its impossible geometry. They were no longer merely processing an item, they were being processed themselves. They moved with a new, urgent purpose, the strange artifact now the unwavering focal point of their existence. Its presence, previously a curiosity, had solidified into an anchor, pulling Blake's attention with an irresistible, almost gravitational force. They had spent the hours since its discovery meticulously, almost ritualistically, documenting its physical characteristics. The material itself was unidentifiable, cool to the touch, yet radiating a subtle, internal warmth that Blake felt more in their bones than on their skin. No seams, no joins, no visible tool marks. It simply was. Blake began their investigation with the facility's digital databases, a sprawling network of records spanning centuries of border activity, trade manifests, geological surveys, and historical incidents. They cross-referenced its estimated dimensions, its peculiar weight, its non-reflective surface. Nothing. The search parameters yielded no matches, no similar items, no mention of its excavation or storage. It was as if the artifact had materialized from a void, bypassing all established protocols of acquisition and cataloging. Frustration gnawed at Blake, a sharp counterpoint to the growing obsession. They shifted to the physical archives, rows upon rows of climate-controlled shelving holding brittle ledgers and microfiche. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. The fluorescent lights of the facility hummed a constant, monotonous drone, a sound that now seemed to vibrate directly behind Blake's eyes. They subsisted on lukewarm coffee from a thermos and energy bars, their sleep cycles dissolving into fitful snatches of dreamless dark. It was in a misfiled box, tucked behind a collection of agricultural import permits from the early 20th century, that Blake found the first unsettling connection. Not a direct reference to the artifact, but a series of hand-drawn sketches in a forgotten logbook belonging to a former inspector. The drawings depicted strange, angular formations in the landscape surrounding the border checkpoint, formations that bore a disturbing, albeit crude, resemblance to the impossible geometry of the artifact. They pulled up geological surveys from the same period. no record of such formations. The landscape was depicted as uniformly flat, unremarkable. Yet, the sketches were undeniable, meticulously detailed despite their agitated lines. The connections began to proliferate, like a malignant growth. A grainy photograph from the 1950s, depicting a group of engineers surveying a new section of the border wall, showed a faint, an old incident report detailing the sudden, inexplicable abandonment of a remote outpost near the border, citing unspecified psychological distress among the personnel. No further details were provided, the case closed as unresolved. Blake found themselves working in an increasingly isolated bubble. They had tried, briefly, to mention the strange findings to a colleague, a junior archivist named the assistant, during a shared lunch break. The assistant had listened politely, a faint, polite smile on their face, before gently suggesting Blake might be overworked in seeing things. The dismissive tone, though well-meaning, had driven Blake deeper into their own investigations, reinforcing the growing chasm between their perception and the mundane reality of others. The artifact, now moved to a secure, rarely accessed corner of the archival facility, seemed to hum with a low, inaudible frequency that only Blake could perceive. Sometimes, when their eyes were tired, the impossible angles on its surface seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Blake would rub their eyes, convinced it was exhaustion, but the sensation persisted, a phantom throb in their peripheral vision. Sleep offered no respite. They began to doubt their own faculties. Was this obsession a symptom of something deeper? Was the artifact merely a catalyst, or was it actively influencing their mind, weaving these disturbing connections from the fragile threads of their sanity? The files contained a collection of fragmented audio logs from a reconnaissance mission decades prior, deep in the desolate, unpatrolled zones near the border. The first few logs were routine. "It's wrong here. They don't move right. There's a shape in the distance. Impossible. It was the same inaudible hum they now perceived emanating from the artifact. Blake stared at the glowing screen, the audio log repeating on a loop. The connections were no longer subtle. They were a web, tightening around Blake, pulling them into a reality far more vast and terrifying than any cataloged record could ever describe. They felt utterly alone, the weight of this impossible knowledge pressing down, threatening to crush their very understanding of what was real. The polite smile of the assistant had solidified Blake's resolve. It was not dismissal, not exactly, but a quiet, almost imperceptible barrier. The kind that made further explanation redundant, even foolish. Blake understood then that this path, whatever it was, had to be walked alone. The artifact, a dull, unremarkable thing of dark, unknown metal, became Blake's singular focus. Every free moment, every stolen hour, was dedicated to its study. They moved it from the secure, climate-controlled vault to a more private, if less official, workspace in a disused corner of the archive's subbasement, a place forgotten by all but the most ancient inventory logs. Here, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and cold stone, a fitting atmosphere for secrets. Blake meticulously documented every facet of the object. What had initially appeared as random scratches now suggested a complex, non-Euclidean geometry, patterns that defied conventional understanding of space. Blake started to perceive these patterns not just on the artifact, but in the ambient dust motes dancing in the lamplight, in the way shadows fell across the stacks of forgotten ledgers. The world began to subtly rearrange itself around the artifact's silent presence. Sleep became a luxury Blake could no longer afford. Their days blurred into an endless cycle of observation, notation, and the consuming, gnawing suspicion that the artifact was not merely an object, but a lens. A lens through which something immense was beginning to peer back. They were not words, not sounds, but rather impressions of sound, a resonant frequency that vibrated directly within Blake's skull, bypassing the ears entirely. It was a pressure, a vast, ancient thought pressing against the fragile confines of their mind. One evening, while tracing a particularly intricate convolution on the artifact's surface, a sudden, blinding flash of insight struck Blake. The artifact was not a record of something, but a fragment of something. A key, perhaps, or a sliver of a greater mechanism that transcended dimension. And the patterns, the shifting geometries, were not symbols, but the inherent structure of a reality that lay just beyond the veil of human perception. This reality was not empty, but teeming with impossible forms and vast, indifferent intelligences. The revelation left Blake breathless, a metallic taste coating their tongue. The word wasn't spoken, but felt, an imperative thrumming in their bones. Blake understood it as a summons, a direction. The artifact, they realized, was not meant to be deciphered in a dusty archive. It was meant to be activated, or perhaps, to guide them to where it could be. And that place, for reasons Blake could not articulate but felt with absolute certainty, was a border. Driven by this new, terrifying clarity, Blake left the archives. The city outside felt alien, its familiar architecture suddenly flimsy, translucent. The sounds of traffic were distorted, the faces of strangers seemed to stretch and warp. They navigated the labyrinthine streets, their internal compass unerringly pulling them towards the city's periphery, towards the edge of known territory. Hours later, the hum of the artifact growing louder, Blake arrived at the border checkpoint. The air here was sharp with the smell of diesel and the distant scent of pine. It was a place designed for control, for demarcation, for the strict separation of here from there. Blake approached the first booth. A uniformed official, his face obscured by the glare of the internal light, gestured them forward. Papers, the official's voice crackled through a speaker, flat and devoid of inflection. Blake reached for their identification, but their fingers brushed against the artifact instead. As their hand closed around the cold metal, the world around them fractured. The official's face, momentarily visible as they leaned forward, was not human. It was a shifting mosaic of impossible angles and flickering, iridescent scales, its eyes too many, too deep. The voice that issued from the speaker was no longer human, but a chorus of grinding stone and distant, mournful wind. The concrete barriers began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. The razor wire pulsed with an inner, sickly green light. The floodlights elongated, stretching upwards into impossibly thin, luminous columns that pierced a sky now filled with swirling, opalescent clouds. Blake's vision swam. The checkpoint, a symbol of order, had become a gateway, a membrane thinning under the artifact's influence. Purpose of travel, the official's voice echoed, now a cacophony of alien intonations. Blake looked down at the artifact in their hand. It was no longer dull. Faint, intricate patterns of light pulsed across its surface, mirroring the impossible geometries now manifesting in the very air. The revelation hit Blake with the force of a physical blow. The artifact was not merely a key, but a transmitter. It wasn't opening a door to a new reality, it was dissolving the one Blake inhabited, allowing the other to bleed through. The cosmic horror was not something that lurked beyond comprehension, it was the fundamental truth of existence, nearly hidden by the fragile construct of human perception. The artifact was simply turning the lights on. Blake looked up, past the impossibly distorted official, past the rippling barriers, into the swirling, prismatic chaos that was now the sky. The confrontation was not with a creature or a force, but with the raw, unfiltered truth of what lay beneath the thin veneer of their reality. And that truth was vast, indifferent, and utterly, irrevocably mad. The barrier had not been to keep things out, but to keep them in. And now, it was gone. The concrete structure of the border checkpoint loomed, a stark geometry against the bruised sky. Blake clutched. The travel bag, the weight of the concealed artifact, a cold, insistent presence against their hip. The air here was thin, metallic, tasting of exhaust fumes and the faint, acrid tang of ozone from unseen scanners. A line of vehicles idled, their engines a low, collective growl, each driver a study in contained impatience. Blake joined the pedestrian queue, a knot of apprehension tightening in their stomach, not for the usual reasons of travel, but for the unpredictable nature of what lay hidden. The checkpoint itself was a series of reinforced booths, their windows reflecting the gray light like vacant eyes. Inside, the border officials moved with a practiced, almost robotic efficiency, their uniforms crisp, their expressions neutral. Blake observed them, searching for any flicker of recognition, any hint that the world was not as it seemed. But they were just people, performing a duty, their gazes sweeping over faces with a detached professionalism. When it was Blake's turn, a border official, a man with close-cropped hair and a name tag that read only officer, gestured them forward. Blake approached the counter, placing their passport on the cold laminate. The official took it, his fingers brushing Blake's for a fraction of a second. The hum intensified. The official's face, perfectly ordinary a moment before, seemed to waver at the edges, as if seen through heat haze. Blake blinked, but the distortion persisted. The official scanned the passport. The machine emitted a soft beep. Blake's gaze was fixed on the official's hands, the way the skin stretched over the knuckles, the faint lines in the palms. Then, a flicker. A momentary displacement. Not of the hand itself, but of the space around it, a brief, almost imperceptible ripple in the visual field. Blake's breath hitched. Any undeclared items? The official asked, his voice now seeming to come from slightly too far away, or perhaps too close. His eyes, fixed on Blake, seemed to deepen, the pupils expanding just a fraction, reflecting a light that wasn't there. Blake's grip tightened on the bag. No, they said, the lie a sharp, metallic taste on the tongue. The artifact pulsed, a rhythmic beat that mirrored Blake's own frantic pulse. The hum was now a low vibration, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very floor, up through Blake's feet, into their skull. The official leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. For a terrifying instant, Blake saw it. Not the man. Not the uniform. But a vast, intricate lattice of something ancient and terrible, woven into the very fabric of his being. His eyes were not eyes, but swirling vortices of impossible color, his skin a thin membrane stretched over an incomprehensible geometry. The uniform was merely a pattern, a surface illusion. Blake's mind reeled. The concrete walls of the checkpoint, the waiting vehicles, the other people in line, they were all part of this same, fragile deception. The other travelers were not people, not truly. They were vessels, conduits, their movements dictated by unseen currents, their thoughts mere echoes of a cosmic hum. Blake saw the patterns in their gait, the way their heads tilted, the vacant, unseeing quality in their eyes, now visible to Blake's altered perception. The official waited, an eternity measured in the shuddering resonance of the artifact. Blake felt their own identity fraying at the edges, dissolving into the overwhelming perception. Was Blake even Blake? Or merely another pattern, another temporary arrangement of matter, given a fleeting illusion of self by the vast, indifferent mechanics of existence? The question was not rhetorical, it was a physical sensation, a tearing at the core of their being. The official's hand reached out, slowly, to retrieve the passport. His fingers, now revealed as slender, articulated segments of something chitinous and alien, brushed Blake's again. The hum of the artifact reached a crescendo, a silent scream within Blake's skull. "Proceed," the official intoned, the word a final, shattering blow. Blake stumbled forward, through the gate, into the space beyond the checkpoint. The world was a cacophony of unseen frequencies, a kaleidoscope of hidden geometries. The sky was not blue, but a churning vortex of impossible colors. The ground beneath their feet was not solid, but a shifting, porous surface that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every sound, every sight, every sensation was now imbued with the horrifying, undeniable truth. Blake was no longer an observer. Blake was merely a part of it, absorbed into the grand, terrible tapestry of unreality, their sanity irrevocably dissolved, leaving only the raw, exposed nerves of a mind that had seen too much. The air here was thin, metallic, tasting of exhaust fumes and the faint, acrid tang of ozone. Blake's breath hitched, a shallow, ragged sound in the quiet hum of the idling engines and the distant, rhythmic clang of something unseen. A tremor ran through their hand, not of fear, but of an unsettling anticipation, a feeling of being on the precipice of an inevitable, terrifying clarity. They moved forward, each step deliberate, the gravel crunching underfoot. The glare of the floodlights intensified, bleaching the color from the surrounding landscape, turning the world into harsh contrasts of light and shadow. A uniformed officer emerged from a small, glass-fronted booth, their silhouette momentarily blocking the piercing light. The officer's expression was unreadable, a professional blankness that Blake found both reassuring and deeply unsettling. This was the final threshold, the last barrier between the known world and whatever lay beyond the boundary. "Passport, please," the officer's voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Blake fumbled in an outer pocket of the travel bag, their fingers brushing against the hard, smooth surface of the artifact. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration resonated through the material, a resonance that seemed to travel directly into Blake's bones. The world around them seemed to shimmer, the edges of the concrete barriers blurring for a fleeting moment. Blake blinked, the sensation receding, but leaving behind a faint afterimage, like a memory of something that had never truly been there. They handed over the document, their gaze fixed on the officer's face. As the officer scanned the passport, their eyes, a flat, unremarkable shade of brown, met Blake's. In that instant, something shifted. The officer's pupils seemed to dilate, not in response to light, but as if absorbing it, becoming vast, depthless pools. Blake felt a sudden, profound disorientation. The meticulously ordered lines of the border checkpoint began to waver. The concrete structures rippled like water, the sharp angles softening, then hardening into impossible geometries that defied logic. The sound of the idling engines stretched, distorting into a low, guttural drone that vibrated in Blake's chest.
A profound, sickening realization bloomed in Blake's mind.
It wasn't the artifact that was revealing the horror, the artifact was merely a key, and the horror had always been here, subtly woven into the fabric of reality, waiting for a perception to align, for a mind to crack open just enough. The officer's face, once ordinary, now seemed to fragment, their features rearranging themselves into an intricate, shifting mosaic of bone and tissue, an impossible topology of human form. Blake saw not a person, but a fleeting, temporary arrangement of matter, held together by an unspoken agreement, a fragile convention. Blake's grip tightened on the travel bag, the artifact now pulsing with a steady, low thrum that echoed the distorted drone of the engines. The air grew heavy, thick with a silent pressure that bore down on Blake's skull. The floodlights above them fractured into 1,000 pinpricks of light, each one a tiny, distant star, then reformed into swirling patterns that defied the laws of optics. The officer, or what remained of their image, extended a hand, not to return the passport, but to gesture towards the boundary beyond.
You have seen.
The words were not words, but a concept, a knowing that permeated Blake's very being. The barrier between self and environment dissolved. Blake felt their consciousness expand, stretching beyond the confines of their skull, beyond the physical limits of their body. They were no longer merely at the border checkpoint, they were the border checkpoint, the concrete, the gravel, the bruised sky, the thin, metallic air.
They were the officer, the idling engines, the distant clang. Blake's physical form remained standing, rigid, unmoving.
Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the impossible geometries of the shifting world. The travel bag slipped from their grasp, falling silently to the gravel. Blake's individual thoughts, their memories, their very sense of self, unraveled, dissolving like smoke into the pervasive, silent hum. They were no longer Blake, the archivist, the seeker of forgotten truths. They were a fragment, a resonant frequency within the larger, terrifying symphony of existence, a silent witness to the truth that had always been there, lurking just beyond human comprehension, now fully, irrevocably revealed. The border checkpoint stood, stark and geometric, against the bruised sky, an ordinary place where, sometimes, the fabric of reality wore thin.